Hey guys, my name is Ria, and welcome back to another video on USACO. So in this video, we're going to go through a comment that I got on a previous video, which gives a question for USACO, and I'm just going to answer it and give some general advice about implementing and debugging. So let's get into it. So the comment says, drawing out more sample test cases and solving them is honestly a really smart idea that I hadn't considered, especially because of what happens to me a lot of the time is I solve the problem like 80%, meaning that I get to the main idea and implement it properly, but there is a small bug that throws the problem off for some number of test cases. And then 90% of the time, when I download the test data from USACO website and see what test case my program fails at, I'm able to fix the program. So he's probably referring to in the video we talked about to debug, one way is to create some test cases by hand as a starting point. And then he says, also, how much time would you suggest should be spent coming up with the idea versus implementing the idea for USACO problems in general? I'm certainly always spending at least 80% of the time implementing the idea, but I also just got started a couple months ago. Now this video is on an advice video where I did a Zoom call with a competitor who was in bronze, who didn't advance, and then he implemented the stuff, and 1 month later he got a perfect score in bronze. So that's sort of the context for this problem, and let's get into it. So he said, how much time would you suggest spent coming up with an idea versus implementing? Then I asked some follow-up questions to them, and they said, on normal USACO bronze problems, it could be as little as 5 to 10 minutes thinking, whereas on the hard and very hard problems, it's definitely close to 30 to 45 minutes. It's usually around 40 to 60 minutes for implementing, and then debugging, it could take up to 3 hours and maybe even several days. Because sometimes the explanation doesn't help at all, so I'm better off reading someone else's code, but that can be quite difficult. Yes, reading someone else's code can be quite difficult. So typically, when you're working on a problem, for silver and above, for a good problem that you'd be able to get in contest, you want to spend 40 minutes thinking about it and 40 minutes implementing and debugging. So that gives you about 1 hour 20 for the problem, which means that 3 problems in a contest would take exactly 4 hours. That's sort of the average you want to be at. Now, easier problems are going to be faster, obviously. Harder problems will take longer. But that's just a good average to keep in mind. So this person is saying they spent 5 to 10 minutes thinking, and some of the hard ones is close to 30 to 45 minutes. That's a perfectly normal number. Thinking for 30 to 45 minutes is great. So your thinking time is well within the good range. And for implementing, it's around 45 to 60 minutes. Now, for USACO bronze, this is actually very high, especially because those problems typically have shorter codes. And so I would say first make it your goal to try to get this number down to say about 30 minutes for some of the easier problems. Just because we want to go step-by-step fashion, right? The easier problems should take a lot faster, but for right now, let's start off with the first step. Let's get these easier problems down to 30 minutes. How do we do that? Well, the first thing is going to be we want the length of our code to be shorter. So if your code length is 100 plus lines for a bronze problem, for an easy bronze problem especially, that's way too long. For an easy bronze problem, most bronze problems can be solved with a code length of less than 40 lines. And sometimes I see people with 200 plus lines in bronze. So getting that code length down. How do we get a code length down? Well, one of the easiest ways is to come up with an organization of what we want our code to look like before we actually start implementing. So this means just having a general idea of this is what the first section is going to be. So the second section is going to be, I might have a function that does this. I might have a for loop that does this. Just having a general idea of what your code is going to look like before you start typing. Before you even type this single letter. Have a general idea what your code is going to look like. Now you can write this on a piece of paper and you can structure out your code. For higher level competitors, like say in gold or above, you may not need to do this. You can just do it in your head, right? And this doing it in your head for a high level competitor may even take like 1 to 2 minutes, honestly. But for bronze, you want to take a lot of time with this because time you take structuring your code before you start implementing will save you a lot of time in the future. So if you spend 5 to 10 minutes structuring what your code is going to look like before you start coding, this can save you more than 1 hour in the actual implementation stage. And that debugging is so frustrating, right? We want to do that because it's frustrating and it's time consuming. So just spending some time beforehand, structuring your code will really help out there. Now, another thing you mentioned is the program doesn't work. Reading the solution could take 3 hours and maybe several days. So you want to make sure that when you're debugging, especially in bronze, and I'm saying this without having seen any of your code, so I'm just making an assumption here. If you're debugging and your code is really long, instead of trying to look for the bug, try to look for ways you can simplify down sections of your code so it's less than 40 lines. And I say 40 lines because like 99% of bronze problems can be solved in less than 40 lines. You will find a problem here and there that can't, but most of them can be. And so if your code is like, say, 150 lines, instead of spending that time debugging it, maybe think to yourself, like, good, first try to debug. But if you're stuck debugging and you're trying to wonder what to do next, what you can maybe do is start taking sections of your code and simplifying it down. Condense your code down to less than 40 lines. A lot of times, long, complicated things just has more bugs in it in general. And it'll cause bugs that will just be fixed. You don't even have to know where the bug came from if the bug's gone. Obviously, it's good to know, but there's no reason you should be spending several days on that. So why do I say condense the code to something shorter? Well, higher level competitors will automatically code in the most condensed way, or like a platinum competitor, even a silver competitor will code bronze problems in less than 40 lines. Now, why do codes get so long? Typically what happens is someone starts coding and they haven't thought through the entire structure of their code, and then they realize, oh, I have to go and do this other thing and change this other part. It's like, oh, I need to do this one thing here, so I have to change this other part of the code before. And they make all these changes, and they end up with something really big and messy. And big and messy contains bugs. And so the easiest way to do that, again, as I said earlier, just spend a few minutes planning out your code before you start actually typing anything, before you start implementing. And that'll save you having to go back and change previous sections of your code. Chances are you go back and you change something and that breaks something else, right? So that makes one thing work, but it breaks something else. And so just making sure you have a plan before you start coding. I hope this helps, and I hope you found it useful.